Welcome to Lair the Alchemist. And today I have a very special guest, Tim Durling from Tim's Vinyl Confession. You've seen him on The Contrarians, you've seen him on Sea of Tranquility, you've seen him all over the place. He's here today to talk about his new book, Let It Be Your Guide, the Kansas Album Review. So, Tim, thank you so much for joining me here at the Lair. Tell us about your new book.
Thanks for having me. This is awesome. Yeah, it's my third book, and it is a panel book modeled very much after Martin Popoff's album by album series. I like the format, and I find it very easy to kind of sculpt together. And my last book was a similar format on Y&T. It was called Down for the Count, the Y&T album review. That did really well, and I'd always known that I wanted to do a book on Kansas because number one, they've been a favorite of mine for a long time. Number two, even though they've got a couple of songs that will always be in classic rock radio rotation, and they sold a lot of albums. To me, they're not at the level that other bands of their era, like Queen and Zeppelin. And to me, they're every bit as good and should be right up there. And they're still making really good new music in recent years. And all of those things combined is why I decided I wanted to go ahead with Kansas as the subject of a book. So I'm really happy with the way it came out, and that people seem to be liking it.
Awesome. Yeah, Kansas is one of those bands that most people know Dust in the Wind. They know Carry On My Wayward Son. There's probably people that hear Dust in the Wind and they're not even sure who the artist is that does it. They sort of fall into that category of like Blue Oyster Cult. Everybody's heard Don't Fear the Reaper and Godzilla, or other bands, Jethro Tull. Everybody knows Aqualung, but they
Yeah.
don't. The average classic rock person who just listens to classic rock radio maybe doesn't really know a whole lot about them. And I'll be honest with you, I've got a whole bunch of Kansas records over there, and I love them and everything. But I don't really know much about the history of the band. In fact, I know almost like I don't really know much about them. And it's weird because I have listened to them a lot, but there again, they're just one of those bands that doesn't, maybe they don't get talked about as much as like Led Zeppelin or Black Sabbath, or, some of those other
Yeah.
Yes or Rush. And, when you're talking about the more progressive rock bands.
There's a lot of reasons, and I think part of the reason is there was never any upfront. They didn't have a distinct look to them. Well, I think
Mhm.
they have a distinct look. I mean, how many bands have a guy with an eye patch? But and how many bands had a violin player?
Right.
But you're absolutely right. And Blue Oyster Cult's a good comparison. I would say, like, Uriah Heep's a good comparison.
Yeah.
Everybody
Yeah.
knows Easy Living or The Wizard, but yeah, it's almost as if classic rock radio decided that, never mind the fact that this band had 14 songs that went into the Billboard Top 100s. Half of those, seven of them were top 40 singles,
Wow. I
and they
didn't
had
know
seven others that were, below number 40. We're just going to play these two songs in perpetuity.
that.
Every once in a while, I will hear Point of No Return,
Yeah.
but
Okay.
not
Right.
very often. And it's kind of weird. I mean, uh, Left Overture, their fourth album, the one that Carry On is on, that's a 5 million seller in the States. That's a big album. Point of No Return, that had Point of No Return and Dust in the Wind, 4 million seller. Their best of that came out in 1984, 4 million seller. They got a live album from '78 too for the show. It's a platinum album, million seller, and um, they have there's five other albums before and after those that are all gold. They've sold a lot of albums, mainly just in the States. Maybe that's part of the reason too. They're primarily, their success is primarily in the States, but I mean they got pockets of fans all over the world, and they're still out there. They're still playing shows in their current lineup, and um, I just really thought that it was important that someone document the great catalog that they have and are still contributing to, because their last album, The Absence of Presence, came out in 2020. Absolutely my favorite album of the last 5 years, no question. It's just so
Mhm.
good. So they're still making quality new music, and I wanted to have a panel discussion on each of the turns out 15 studio albums that they did, and I wanted to give just as much attention to the latter stuff as to the well better known 70s stuff. Um, yeah, I don't know. It's a really weird example of a band who have almost songs that are better known than the band that do them. And I think you
Yeah.
raise a good point. There's probably a lot of people that they could sing "Carry On Wayward Son" at karaoke. They could sing "Dust in the Wind." Maybe they don't even know that's the same band that does it because they're so different, right? That's the
Yeah.
diversity. Another thing, there's a question that comes up in the book a lot: Arkansas prog.
Mm.
And I was on Sea of Tranquility with Pete Pardo and with Scott from the Prog Corner. The three of us debated, Arkansas prog. And to me, I said, it's not about the moments when they are quote unquote not prog. It's what they do when they are. It's the chops
Mhm.
that they have that I just think they're incredibly diverse because within the Kansas catalog, you'll find, we'll find progressive songs, very long songs, long suites of songs. Um, you'll find really heavy moments. You'll find blues. You'll find a little bit of Southern rock. When you get into the 80s, you get a little AOR. I just think they're incredibly diverse. And it's a rich catalog that not enough people know in its entirety. Like I
Mhm.
said, those two albums they put out, 5 million, 4 million. They're in a lot of homes. That best of's in a lot of homes, but there's a lot more to dig into, and not least of which is that latter day stuff.
Yeah, and that's a good point about them. Like, they're sort of one of these bands that straddles a bunch of lines. They're not 100% in the prog world. Like when people first you think of prog bands from the 70s, you're going to say King Crimson and yes, and eventually you're probably going to mention Kansas, but they're like not the first band that people necessarily think of.
Exactly, and I
They're
think that they should
heavy.
be up up there, like with the. I've always said they're like the kings of the second tier
Yeah,
of
yeah.
classic rock bands, and that they're worthy of more. That catalog is strong enough that they should be elevated up there. And it's almost like they needed one or two more albums that sold as many as Left Overture and Point of No Return to cement that. But you're right; they're not often first
And even with
on
the heavy
people's
thing,
lists.
they're heavy, but I don't think anybody would consider them heavy metal,
No,
but they're heavier than some other classic rock bands, maybe
they're
from
heavier than Yes.
yeah, exactly. There's
I
like
love Yes, but I mean, Yes have some pretty mellow moments, right?
right.
No drums, just you know. And I mean, Kansas do too. There's all kinds of things, but when they do have a riff, it's a heavy one, and it's really really good. And I think people might be surprised at some of the stuff. I know we're going to get into that. The best songs to start if you like the heavy stuff, but um, like I said, I just think there's an incredible amount of diversity. They've had a lot of different, like a lot of these classic bands, they've had a lot of players come through. Some have come and gone,
Yeah.
um, but there's a core sound, and there's a core sound that enables them in their more recent years. They can play something from any part of that catalog and have it sound good.
Yeah. So who are you mentioned that it's a panel book? Who are some of the people that contributed to the book?
Right. Well, I mean, I've talked about some of them. I mean, I've got, Grant Arthur's in here, John the Music Nut. I've got Nathan from the Deep Purple podcast. I've got Daniel Bosch, Darcy Briggs, Ches Cetra, John. I'm just going through the list. John Clauser from my music corner. Um, I've got John Elephant, who was Kansas vocalist in the
Mm.
early 80s. He replaced Steve Walsh. He contributes to the albums that he was on. Todd Evans, Steve Fleck, Chad Green, Peter Jones, Mike Ladano, Scott Lade, Laurie Larson, Pontus, Norshamar, Pete Pardo, Stephen Reed, Jax Russell, Eric Savio, Steve Smits, John T. Snow, Brendan Snyder, Jeff Wagner, who also wrote the forward, William Walker, John Wetmore, and Jeff Witcher. And I mean, I know a lot of those names people will recognize. A lot of them have their own channels. So yeah, I've got more panelists in this book than I did for the Y&T book, and I thought I had quite a few for that. But there were a lot of people that wanted to
Nice.
talk about this band.
Yeah. Yeah. And I like this format. I know you mentioned it. Martin Popoff
Yeah,
has done this. And I like this format because you sort of get different opinions people coming at these albums from different angles, and I find it fascinating. Like if it's a band that I really like, I like this format because you don't have to read it from beginning to end. You can usually just kind of jump to certain albums if you want to.
Yep.
So whenever I get books like this, I always jump to like the album that maybe I like that most people don't like, or that controversial album that the fans sort of don't really care for, because I'm always like curious. Oh, I'm curious what they're going to say about this
Those are,
particular record,
yeah,
or
those are the, yeah, John, those are by far the most fun
yeah.
to get to, because most people are going to agree that Left Overture is a great album. You know, it's
Right.
hard to argue with 5 million copies sold. Most people will agree Point of No Return is a great album. You know, how do people feel about an album like Drastic Measures that's very, very 80s keyboardy, you know, electronic drums sounding? How do people feel about that one? Those are the really interesting ones to dig into, because and you also have, yeah, I like the format. I mean, the first one of Martin's books that I got was his Queen album by album, and that's one of my favorites
Mhm.
that he's ever done. And it's just like having a bunch of people sitting around. You ask them all a question, and you can get people agreeing, you can get people disagreeing, but you've got people that, you know, have been into the band from the beginning or close to the beginning. You've got people that came along like midway through. I put myself in that category, and you've got relatively either new fans or casual fans said, you know, listen to these three albums and see what you think. So you're getting all kinds of opinions. And, you know, sometimes it's the new listener that can come in and say, did you ever notice that this sounds like that?
Mhm.
And someone who's lived with this stuff for years go, I never noticed that before. That's
Yeah.
the great thing about it. If you can learn things, if you're, as you're being, you know, not only am I the writer, but I learn things from talking to so many different people. And the super fans are as fun to talk to as the brand new fans. It's all
Mhm.
good. It's all legitimate. And, you know, nobody's opinion can be wrong.
Right.
So it's just really great to see how all of these different people react listening to the same group of songs.
Yeah. Okay, so you mentioned that they've got 15 albums.
Yeah.
So let's say you got somebody they know Carry On My Wayward Son, Point of No Return, Dust in the Wind. They're a rocker, they're a metalhead. Where do you start with this cat? You mentioned that keyboard sort of drum machine album. Maybe that's not the best place for somebody
Yeah.
to start.
You
Because
know,
sometimes with bands that have big catalogs like this, I often say, man, if you make a mistake and you come in, like look at Jethro Tull, they've got a ton of albums. If you come in on the wrong record, you may think like, oh my gosh, is this what this? I've heard people talk about this band, and oh, is this what they're about? Like, oh, forget about it. So sometimes it's dangerous when bands have these really big catalogs and it's you don't really know where to start. So where should a hard rocker, heavy metal guy that just knows a little bit about Kansas, where do you recommend they start?
well, it's a great question, and it's not going to be a short answer. um, but you're absolutely right. You are so right. It's almost, you almost want, there are some bands, and I know I've talked to Martin about this on the Contrarians. There are some bands that have pretty safe catalogs, and I don't
Hmm.
mean safe as in everything sounds the same, but we were talking about Rat,
Hmm.
and you can't
I
really
remember
go
that video.
wrong. You can't
Yeah.
really go wrong with a Rat album, because
Hmm.
every Rat album sounds like Rat.
Hmm.
Maybe not every song is great as out of the cellar, but it's Rat, and there's bound to
Hmm.
be you're going to get a feel for what the band is about. You know, if someone, the example that I like to give, if somebody's curious about Alice Cooper, okay, maybe they know School's Out, maybe they know Poison, maybe they know No More Mr. Nice Guy, and maybe they've seen him on TV, and I should listen to him. All my friends that like really heavy stuff, you know, always talk about how great Alice Cooper is. And you know, they go to their, you know, discount store, and they find one of those repackagings of that, the
Hmm.
awful like 1969
Hmm.
Toronto Rock and Roll Revival concert. You barely make out what songs they're doing. They could listen to that and go, this sucks. This is awful. I'm never listening to this guy again. This is what are these people talking about? Or, you know, by the same token, very similar situation, especially when you have things that get reissued all the time. You know, if you talk about Deep Purple, say, yeah, Deep Purple, one of the classic bands of all time, and they go and they listen to the best of the Mark One lineup, they're going to be like,
Hmm.
I don't know about this.
That's the exact
So,
mistake I made with Deep Purple. My first Deep Purple record was one of those first three albums,
yep,
that has a really cool medieval looking cover on it.
yep.
It looks
I know
really heavy. It reminded me of that Black Sabbath Greatest Hits
I know
cover. And I
exactly.
thought, oh, man,
It's
this
the
is going to
third
be,
one. It's got the Bosch painting on it,
yeah.
like the
I'm like,
Garden of
this is going
Earthly
to be
Delights,
so heavy.
and
I'm
it's
ready
not.
for it. And it's just like,
It's
what the
it's
heck is this,
it's like
man?
it sounds like it's 1,000 years old, and it's psychedelic, and it's like, wow, this
Yeah.
is terrible. And that's the crazy thing about it, because just 1 year later, out comes In Rock, and that's a pretty
Right.
safe place to start for
Right.
Deep Purple. If you don't like that, well, you're probably not going to like Deep Purple. So for Kansas, I mean, there is such a thing as a well chosen compilation. I actually talked about that on Grab a Stack of Rock not long ago. Um, Compilations, some might say, well, that's a cheap way out, but it's oftentimes it's the most readily available thing. And the original best of from 1984, I don't think you can go wrong with that, because it's got a pretty good cross section. Now, there isn't anything particularly heavy on that one, but it does give you a good uh, idea of what they were all about. But there's one that came out in Europe on Sony, in 1997, called the Definitive Collection. That's really good for a lot of reasons. It has the songs that you'd expect, but it also digs a little bit deeper. And what I like about that one is that the Kansas initial catalog, 74 to 83, they were on CBS, or so what later became Sony. That's usually what you see compiled. But this one, even though it's on Sony, it digs into the latter years. So it's got some of the MCA albums, it's got some of their independent albums. That's a good one. But boy, that the first album that they have that they came out with in 1974, their self-titled debut. There's the last song on that album is called "Death of Mother Nature Suite,"
Hmm.
and it's got a riff that, if you just heard the riff in and of itself, you'd be like, "Is this some Sabbath tune I've never heard before?" It's heavy,
Yeah. Yeah. I know that
and
song.
it's
Yeah.
it's really menacing sounding. That's a great one. It's also that first album's also got Journey from Mariabron, which has got a lot of violin in it, but it's dynamic. It's got heavy sections, Belexes, or however you say it. That's another kind of a heavy one. The trouble is with that album is it doesn't start off heavy. It starts off with "Can I Tell You," which is more. It's got more of that boogie rock thing to it.
Hmm.
So it's a hard. You'd almost have to custom make one for someone. But if somebody was on YouTube and they wanted to hear the heaviest Kansas songs, I would definitely say "Death of Mother Nature Suite," Journey from Mariabron, Bill X's. Lonely Street is like a really heavy blues song. The Devil Game's a heavy one. Child of Innocence, Mysteries and Mayhem. And yeah, that'd be a pretty good start there for their early catalog. And if somebody, was sort of more of an 80s AOR uh, person, I usually send them to the album Power from 1986. That was the first of two albums they did with Steve Morse on guitar. So it's
Okay.
got lots of guitar pyro. It's very commercial, but you don't necessarily have to be well versed in Kansas to listen to that album and enjoy it. I always compare, and I mentioned this in the book. I think that Power is to Kansas what 90125 is to Yes.
Mm.
Just a good 80s rock album. Unfortunately, it didn't sell nearly as well as 90125, but that's a pretty safe start if you like 80s rock music. I mean, it's just a good, solid album. And, you know, Freaks of Nature, which is an album, their first independent album, they put it out in 1995. That's got some seriously heavy stuff on it. I might send someone to that album because, yeah, that's got Black Fathom 4 and I Can Fly and the title song. Yeah, boy, you know what? For that, if we are going to measure an album by heaviness, I think I would say Freaks of Nature 95. If it's all about decibels, I'd start there.
Oh, yeah, I've never heard that one, so I'll have to go check that out.
Yeah, that's a really really strong, like, I'm gonna call it a latter day album.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so where can people get more information and about ordering the book? And you mentioned your Y&T book. You have other books, right, that you've got
Yeah,
too. So where would
yeah.
somebody go to get more information on all this and to order these books?
They're all available on Amazon. This is the Y&T book, Down for the Count, with artwork by no less than Hugh Syme. which is
Wow.
amazing. It was just so cool. I was able to speak to him and get him to do this
Very cool.
awesome cover. My first book was called Unspooled: An Adventure in
Yeah.
8 Tracks,
Yeah.
because 8 tracks were manufactured longer than anyone might think. Just because they disappeared from stores in the early 80s doesn't mean if you were a member of Columbia House, you were still getting 8 tracks. Kind of
Hmm.
chronicles that. They're all available on Amazon, and all anyone needs to do is type in my name, Tim Durling. Um, I don't think it's got a funny spelling to it, but yeah, if you type that in, the first three things you see are those three books. So it's doing well, and I really appreciate all the support, and I appreciate folks like yourself having me on to chat about it, because I have no publisher, I have no agent, I'm doing this myself. So it's a labor of love, and it's just getting the word out there, because like I said, this is a band that sold a lot of albums. There's a huge rabid fan base. I mean, Kansas fans, they refer to us as wheat heads. So there's a lot of wheat heads out there that I'm sure would be like, oh, there's a book that goes through each Kansas album. Yeah, I want people
Yeah.
to know about it. And I'm really happy with the cover to this album,
Yeah.
this book. My good friend Matt Phillips, his company Go North Design, he's helped me with all my books. And this is an AI cover with some heavy editing, because I kept telling him there was certain imagery I wanted in it. And
Hmm.
like a good, prog rock album, the more you look at this front and back cover, the
Yeah.
more you see in it. I wanted it to be something like, well, the Best of Kansas front and back cover has this, but if you're a Rush fan, it's like Exit Stage Left. If you look at it, you can see all this different imagery from their other albums. And also anybody that's you know bought old CDs on the CBS label, that's why I did this with
Cool.
the
Yeah.
spine of it, because it's that impact font, right? I wanted
Yeah.
red on white, and I wanted it to look like an old CD. So and it
Nice.
just so happens Kansas were a band that were on CBS. So yeah, yeah, I'm really happy with it, and the response has been good. And yeah, if you're a diehard Kansas fan, you'll find a lot to like about this book. If you're a casual fan, I'm hoping that you can pick this up and go, well, now I at least know where to start. Now I know,
Yeah.
get an idea from reading, and like you're saying, you can get an idea from each of the panels what kind of album we're talking about here.
Hmm.
When we talk about Drastic Measures, this is not a heavy album. This is not a traditional Kansas sounding album. It's not even particularly prog, but it just might be your thing. So yeah, it's all here.
Awesome. All right, everybody. Well, make sure you head on over to Amazon then to get Tim's new book, Let It Be Your Guide, the Kansas album review, as well as Tim's other books. Make sure you check out his YouTube channel, Tim's Vinyl Confessions. I'll leave links where I can down in the description below. And thanks, Tim, for coming on joining me here at the Lair to discuss your new book. And hopefully, we'll have you back here in the future.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'd love to come back. Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
All right, everybody, till we see you again, make sure you rock hard, ride free.